Hello, this is Key Ideas, and I'm your host, Leila Viss. This podcast contemplates the rhythm of life as a piano teacher and music maker. Through illuminating interviews and transparent reflections, you'll feel validated, encouraged, and empowered. This is episode number 64, which features my good friend and colleague, Emily McGree. I've always admired Emily McGree from afar whenever she hosted the National Piano Foundation webinars during the heart of the COVID season with her esteemed colleagues, including Richard Rahino. I was fortunate to powwow with Emily via email about plans for the recreational music making track at the Music Teachers National Association conference for the past 3 years. And even though we both live in Colorado, we've never met face to face thanks to the conferences being held online instead of in person. We became several degrees closer when we met over the phone because of unfortunate circumstances. Days after a life-altering family tragedy, I resigned as the piano prep coordinator at the University of Denver. The next year, my good friend and colleague Chi Tan stepped away from her position as head of piano pedagogy. Emily and I began holding long conversations as the baton was passed to her as the newly appointed professor of piano pedagogy and the piano prep program director at Lamont School of Music. In June of this year, we finally met in person for the first time at the Colorado State Music Teachers Association State Conference, and now whenever we can swing it, we meet up and have a hard time cutting off our chats. Today, you're invited to eavesdrop on our conversation about neurodivergent students and how we as teachers can adjust to suit their learning styles. If you've heard the term neurodivergent but aren't sure what it means, or if you have observed behavior in students that indicate that they may learn differently, but you can't target how to guide them, or if you are in need of resources for how to help students with anxiety, then stay tuned. Emily has so much to share, and you will find her insight and advice incredibly valuable as you teach privately or in groups. Throughout our conversation, Emily uses several initialisms to abbreviate disorders. To help you make the most of this interview, remember that ASD stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. By the way, ADD is an outdated term for what is now called ADHD. Some people with ADHD have hyperactive behaviors and some don't, but the diagnosis is ADHD either way. Before we get started, here's more about Emily.
Emily Book McGree is currently on the faculty at the Lamont School of Music, where she's the head of piano pedagogy and directs the piano preparatory program. She also runs a private studio in Lafayette, Colorado. Emily is a frequent presenter at the national and state music teacher conferences. She has served on the planning committee for the Pedagogy Saturday recreational music making track at MTNA conferences for many years. She's also president-elect of the Colorado State Music Teachers Association. Emily has also served on faculties at the University of Northern Colorado, the University of Colorado at Boulder, Front Range Community College, and was the education director at a large community school for almost a decade. Now here's Leila with Emily.
So hello, Emily. It is wonderful to have you join me on this podcast. So let's jump right in because this is a hot topic. And I'm sure I'm speaking for most teachers that we need clarity on neurodiversity and how we can best accommodate the students who populate our piano benches.
Thanks for having me, Leila. It's great to be here.
So can we first go to how to define the term neurodiversity?
Yes, and you sent me a fabulous description or a definition. I think about it as a bunch of different things. But I'm going to pull up. Sorry, I didn't have that up.
Oh, I have it here. I can read it for you. Neurodivergent is a non-medical term that describes people whose brain develops or works differently for some reason.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things when I read research on how to teach or how to parent or how to just converse with neurodiverse students and adults for that matter, it what is categorized as neurodiverse is widely different. Sometimes sources will say that is referring to students with ASD or autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, students that might have generalized anxiety disorder. It can also refer to students who are gifted and talented. And those students also tend to have or can have other comorbidities that go with that. So social challenges, anxiety disorder, ADHD, a lot of those things can go hand in hand with GT kiddos. And that's sort of where I got interested in this.
Well, that's where I want to go to next, is how did you become interested in it?
Yeah, so I teach down at Lamont, and I guess my interest started way before this, but in our preparatory program here, we have a lot of students that come from a school called RICS, which is a school for gifted and talented students. And that primarily is where most of our population comes from, and they're in our group classes. So there are a variety of challenges and successes, cool things that happen with teaching GT kids. But it also, we need to learn a little bit more about how to properly access their skills, and we see some differences in the classroom. So of course they can be extremely smart. They can, we might not have to spend as much time teaching the musical alphabet or where middle C is on the piano, but they might have other challenges. And some of those might be social emotional. Some of those might be self-regulation. Some of those might be just general behavior issues. There are a lot of sensory challenges that can come with that as well. So that's sort of where I got interested in this. And then I have two kiddos. They're 4 and 6-year-olds, and as they grew up a little bit, and they're not old yet, but thankfully, they also have some challenges in the GT world. Both of them have some sensory issues, anxiety issues. So then I started doing a pretty big deep dive in how we teach these kids, how I can parent my own kids. And how we can just sort of interact with the neurodiverse population, because it's huge. I know the numbers say 30 to 40%, but it's probably, I'm going to bet, way higher than that. And sometimes yeah.
You and I were talking about that. We're like, okay, don't you think we're all on the spectrum?
Yeah, I know.
And that's what we're talking about, right? Is, I don't hear that word neurodiverse nearly as much as on the spectrum, but that's what we're really talking about. Is that correct?
Well, no, actually on the spectrum refers to just people who have been identified with autism spectrum disorder. So that is different from your ADHD kids, from your kids with general anxiety disorder, from your kids who have Tourette's or dyslexia, or any of those other mental disorders that can come with ASD, but they're different. So they're kind of different buckets. And if you do any reading or just kind of looking online about that, there are all of these little like Venn diagram situations that happen. And in a lot of, it gets tricky because a lot of the symptoms, I guess I would say, or behaviors are similar between a lot of the different disorders or neurodiversities out there. So it becomes challenging for us as teachers and parents and community members to figure out, what it is that we're dealing with and how to appropriately address things.
Well, let's go there next then, because you wear many hats.
Yes.
Let me just list them for you, just in case you're not aware, okay? Because you are a piano teacher, you're a piano professor, you mentor graduate students, you teach group piano, you are an administrator, and wait a minute, you're a mom, and you're soon to be the Colorado State Music Teachers Association president. Okay, so that's quite a few hats there. Just wondering if you still want to say yes to all of those or not, but but okay, you run into a lot of people. You interact with a lot of people. So now that you've got this knowledge that's accumulating in your own mind, how are you interacting differently with, because you said adults will have this as well. Is that correct? Yeah.
I think, just in our climate in general, we're trying, or at least in my world, we're trying to move to a more inclusive, just presence, right? And one of the things that I think developed is the ability to see that behaviors are really just a form of communication, right? And sometimes, depending on if I have my administrator hat on, right? I might need to give directions or write emails or do things in a different way so that they can be received, right? And I think it's also the understanding that how we are saying things as individuals and how we're perceiving that isn't necessarily what the other person is receiving and how they're interpreting it. So if we can understand a little bit more about what makes them tick as an individual, we can more effectively have communication. And that's really the most important part to all of those hats.
Well, and I have to say that I am so guilty of making assumptions. So I think what you're saying is we cannot make assumptions because we're thinking one way, someone else may not be thinking that way.
Yeah. Well, and it's, as musicians, I think that we maybe interact with the neurodiverse population a bit more than many, some other career fields. And we can see a student who maybe struggles to have eye contact with us, or as maybe that person is not interested or doesn't want to interact with us, or they're not wanting to be here, when that's not really the case. Or if they're having trouble sort of reading our figure of speech, they don't understand exactly what we're saying. That's not an intellect problem. It's that's just how their brain works. We use figures of speeches all of the time when we are teaching, and sometimes those metaphors and analogies and figures of speeches don't get across the way that we think that they're going to. So I think we have to be careful about that communication piece.
And communication and being socially acceptable or accepted, that's, I think, where we struggle as teachers, is because you're right. I read it one way. Like, oh, this kid does not want to be here, And so then I know how I know my frame of mind changes about that child as well. So that was one thing that you're kind of leading into then, is we as piano teachers, we vet a lot of our students. They come in our door. We're like, let's see who you are. And what are some signs? I don't like the word symptoms, but what are some things that we should just be looking for so that we know what we're getting into?
Yeah, I think the tricky thing is that the answer to that question can vary widely depending on the type of disorder the student has. You might see that they just have a general distracted tendency about them and they have trouble focusing. You might see some repetitive movements. So maybe there's a lot of rocking. Maybe there's some hand fidgeting that's happening. Maybe, they're not as comfortable sitting still. You might see restricted interests. So with ADHD students and ASD students, they can get hyper-focused about the things that they're really interested in. But if you present them with a repertoire piece or an exercise or an activity that doesn't relate to what they're doing, you might see some issues there. There might be challenges with transitions from one activity to the next or coming into the classroom. You might see some struggles with retaining information or utilizing what we call working memory, resistance to new activities and pieces, and physical challenges too. I think, sometimes with some of these disorders, there are gross motor and fine motor challenges that students have. So things like understanding high-low, right, left, up, down, crossing the midline with arpeggios or pushing our left hand over top of our right hand to utilize the next octave on the piano, clapping or doing rhythm activities. Some of those things can be really challenging for students. And then I also think, social challenges. So if you're teaching a group class, you might see some different interactions happen, maybe some issues with emotional regulation, self-regulation, and then some sensory needs. So if you see fidgeting or notice that a student's eyes are darting around the classroom a lot, or if they're getting distracted with something, those are kind of that's a big bucket list, but
It
and
is.
it can be a lot of different things, right? And one, I remember when I first started asking questions about kiddos on the spectrum with ASD or ADHD for that matter. One of the therapists that I was talking to said to me, if you meet one kid with ASD, you've met one kid with ASD. It doesn't look the same. And I think, one of the things that we were talking about when we were growing up, it's it was like the hyperactive kid in the corner, right? Or the kid who wouldn't pay attention, or the kid who was just weird or eccentric or something like that. And we labeled people that way, of like that was just them. They were bad kids, or they didn't pay attention, or they had behavior problems or something like that. Instead of really understanding, which I think that we are moving towards now, of, well, what is that person trying to tell us? What is the communication that they're trying to get across? And how do we need to adjust our teaching environment to meet the needs of that individual?
Hey, we'll get right back to the conversation, but I want to make sure you know about some of the music I use to immediately engage students, especially those students who learn differently. It's important to me that these pieces be fun to play and easily taught by rote, so the student goes home excited about playing a cool piece. Composer Wendy Stevens offers a vast selection of my all-time favorite rote and reading pieces. I know that if you try just one piece, you'll see why her music is known as music kids love. So I'm excited that Wendy is offering to give any Key Ideas listener a popular, big-sounding elementary piece called The Bold Escape for free. It's one that can be introduced through rote teaching if you prefer. Just put the piece in your cart and enter the coupon code Key Ideas. That's KEYIDEAS, all one word. Then hit checkout and it's yours to use over and over again. I think you and your students will love it. Look for a link to your studio license of The Bold Escape in the show notes. Now, back to my chat with Emily.
There's a couple of things that came to mind. And number one, resistance is a word that I see, and it particularly between the student and the parent when I am interviewing. You can tell what's going on just by their interaction, and the mom or dad saying, oh, stop, listen, or, they're trying to correct, autocorrect, and because they want them to behave at the lesson. So those are signals to me, and I don't ding them for it. I'm like, oh, okay, a little bit of regulation issues, but I don't mind that. But I do notice that the parent relationship is pretty important.
Yeah, it is. And, I think at least, from my experience along this journey myself, parents are on a wide spectrum, if I can use that word in a different way, in their understanding of what their kid needs to. It's a really hard process to walk through as a parent, and they may or may not be to the point where maybe they know their kid's a little different. Maybe they know they've got some challenges or some struggles, but they don't know what that is. Yeah. And they haven't gone through the evaluation process yet, or they're on a waiting list for 12 months or whatever the case might be, or they're frustrated because they know they need help, but they're worried that their student is not going to be able to succeed in a various situations.
Well, you think about it, when you decide to be a parent, you're all excited about this new baby, right? And you're worried about the baby and okay, how's the delivery going to go? You don't even think about if the baby may learn differently, So I remember that being a surprise for one of our sons. He was an out of sync child, had never heard of that before. Mm-hmm. So the parent is learning right along with us and right along with their child. And so I think we have to be patient, but we also have to be aware ourselves. Yeah. And so can we go to something, because crossing the midline seems to be one of the most important things. And I noticed in one of my students that he had a really hard time crossing the midline. And he also shows and exhibits some other issues. So why is that so important to a child?
Well, I think, for a lot of reasons, it's a predictor of language development. It's a predictor of gross motor skills. It's imperative for a student to be able to develop properly. And like you mentioned, the out of sync kid, right? It is a pretty big indicator that kiddo, whatever the disorder might be, has something going on probably. It might just be a gross motor delay. It might be some small sensory processing disorder. It might not be, ASD or one of the other bigger disorders, but something that we definitely want to pay attention to. And I think that as piano teachers, we have a lot of ability to impact that. There are so many activities that we can do to help encourage that student to develop the crossing the midline ability, and that's important when we're planning activities for our private lessons and our group classes to make sure that we're aware of that and looking at the signs.
Can you first of all explain what crossing the midline is?
Yeah.
Because some may not know what that means.
Yeah. So we sort of have this like imaginary line that goes down the middle of our body from our head all the way down to our feet. So kind of like cutting us in half. And students who have issues or struggles crossing the midline can't necessarily get their right hand easily over to their left side of their body, and vice versa, the left hand over to the right side of the body. So for instance, if you have so I'm right-handed, and if I have a pencil that's sitting on my left-hand side, right, I will naturally reach my right hand over to grab that pencil. A student who has trouble crossing the midline is just going to grab that with their left hand, no matter if they're left hand dominant. So it's a struggle for them to sort of cross that imaginary line, which as a pianist we can imagine the number of issues that might present down the road.
Yes. And I did a little bit of research. This is all just Google research, not really in depth, but it does seem to make connections in the brain too, right?
Yeah.
So
it's about our brain being able to cross to different parts, right? So if a student is not crossing the midline, their parts of their brain are not talking to each other in the most effective way. So just the development can be problematic for a student when we're talking about movement or really anything else. It's language development. It's how we perceive our senses or how we perceive language when someone is talking to us. It's a really important step that I think we're doing more and more research about, and that's certainly not an area that I'm an expert on, but we'll watch for the signs in students if I'm noticing some challenges there.
So I am curious, do you have a few little games that are actually tests for students? They don't know that they're being tested, but is there one that we can tell pretty quickly if they may have trouble crossing the midline?
Yeah. So, there's a few different things that you can do. And we use them, at least in our group classes at Lamont, as brain breaks, right? So it just is okay, we're going to take 2 or 3 minutes and go over here and do this. One of them, which is very easy to utilize in a music classroom, is scarfs, right? So if you're playing scarfs and getting the student to kind of cross over to the other side of their body, or kind of move their scarf in and out of their legs, or just encourage free flow in that way, that's always a good macro movement activity to utilize as a brain break or just a general movement activity in your classroom. There are other things that students can do just sitting at a bench too. And one of those is if you have, a beat going and you have them tap their right hand, you can, work on a finger or whatever it is that student needs to work on, and their foot at the same time. So we go back and forth between right, left, and then you switch it on them and see if they can tap their right hand while their left foot is tapping.
Oh.
So crossing, right, that imaginary midline and going right and left at the same time, and then opposite, and back and forth that way. You can also have a student stand up, again, if you need to just have a brain break or a macro movement in your lesson or class, and have them stand like towards a window or a wall, and they're going to keep their head and their upper body straight towards that, and they're going to put out their right and their left leg, and then see if they can switch to the other side. So right side of your body, left side of your body, right side of your body, and left side of your body. And then just like with the tapping activity, well, can you put your left foot out front and your right arm out front, and then switch and then do it the other way? So those, those are some pretty simple activities to see. I've seen other teachers use the whole, like, we're going to tap our head and rub our belly thing, just different coordination ideas like that can be done really simply to see if you've got a student who is maybe struggling with that a bit.
Well, you can probably see it right away, because I'm just thinking, okay, right arm, left, like I'm even thinking, that's not an easy thing to do.
It's not. And even if you do some simple stretches at the beginning of the class too, like, okay, let's loosen up, and you've had a long day at school and now you're here and we've got or with your adult students or whatever. And pushing your right hand across your body or behind your, and seeing if we struggle with any of those just general stretch movements that we sort of take for granted as adults, but they're really hard to learn sometimes. So just checking in on that and seeing how the body is working, because that's going to have a large impact on how we learn and in what way we need to learn at the piano specifically.
I don't know if this is related at all, but I thought everyone could touch their toes easily. And I was born being able to touch my toes very easily. I see my dad and my sons, like, they cannot, that is just something they cannot do. And I don't know if that has anything to do with learning at all, but everybody is different. So again, here I go making assumptions. So you're right, getting them to move and then knowing what to look for, right? When they can't do something, we don't necessarily point it out, but we are just putting a little sticky note in our brain, like, oh, okay, got to work on that.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to ask questions of parents as well. As when you're intaking students into your private studio group classes or whatever, to ask some pretty specific questions about, like, are you noticing? Does your child struggle with any movement activities? Do they have a behavior plan in place at school? Are they, if you notice some of those things that you were talking about in terms of self-regulation concerns. I think it's also important, though, to do that away from the students because, you don't know if the parent, maybe the student is diagnosed with ADHD and the parent has not told the student that yet. So you don't want to introduce those ideas in front of the student. But then that also gives you, a way to gauge what language is happening at home too. So if a student is struggling with self-regulation, are we talking about red zones and green zones? Are we talking about, what is the language around that, so that you can also be able to reach the student with similar language in their lesson or class to help them regulate or do whatever it is that they are needing in terms of sensory or just learning abilities.
I think it's important to walk a little bit on tiptoes, because
yes.
As piano teachers, we are not experts, right?
Yeah.
We just have a sense, like, usually people are okay with this, and your child is not. So you don't want to tell the parents that in those words. And I had to talk to a parent about that, because I'm concerned about some things. But then I went back to my experience with our son and try to go about it that way and say, look, I don't know for sure, but I'm just getting a sense. And, like, do you have any good words for us to use so that we can kind of calm parents down and not think that we know? I don't want to appear like I know everything.
Yeah. I honestly don't ask outright about ADHD or any of the other things, even anxiety. I ask only about behaviors. So for example, I'm seeing this in the lesson. Is this an issue that happens in the classroom or at home? And has Johnny's teacher found any ways to really help him with that process? Because again, behavior is communication, right? That's the student trying to tell us, or their body telling us that something is not the way that it either needs to be for them, or it's their way of sort of calming themselves down. And our job is to figure that out. So I think talking about behaviors really only, right? And you can ask, does your child have a a specific learning modality that they lean towards? Are they oral learners? Are they kinesthetic learners? Are they visual learners? I think the tricky thing with that is that students change. What they are when they're 6 is not necessarily what they're going to be when they're 9. So some of that is better for you to figure out as the teacher as you walk through the process. But I think some specific questions about behaviors, how, if they have any teachers and what that they've really bonded to, and what personality are you seeing with those types of teachers? Are there classroom environments that they are more successful in? And in that way, you might find out, okay, my kiddo does better with a smaller class, or my kiddo needs to be away from the window, or my kiddo needs to be right next to the teacher because they have problems hearing all of the, they can't necessarily process it unless they're directly next to the teacher. So there's some different things that you might find out if you ask about specific behaviors, and then what types of successful learning experiences that student has had.
Yeah, I think those are two great questions. What behaviors you're noticing, and then what has been successful.
Yep.
And then then you're not passing judgment.
No,
you're just getting information.
Yeah, it's important not to pass judgment at all, and to really go into it from a team mentality. You're working with the parent to try to figure out the best course of action for that student, because we're trying to reach all kids, right? Like we're teaching piano because we think it's important. We know the benefits that it can have for all students, and we're just trying to figure out the best way to make that happen. And I think if we address it that way, I think we can get somewhere. If you go into it like, I think your kid has ADHD, I mean, that's like a brick wall, right? You're not going to get through that.
Yeah. They'll shut down and they'll leave.
It's not helpful.
Well, as I expected, we went long. Remember me saying that Emily and I have a hard time shutting it down? So look for part 2 of our conversation coming up in the next episode, in which she gives specific tips on how to manage neurodivergent kiddos in a group setting. And we even tackle the topic of anxiety in kids. It's a significant honor to have Wendy Steven supporting Key Ideas. Make sure to head to the show notes for a link to grab your free studio license digital download of Wendy's cool piece, The Bold Escape. Remember to use Key Ideas, all one word and no caps, when you hit the checkout button. I'm Leela Viss. Thanks for being here, and see you in the trenches.